Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 15th of February. In last class, I introduced the idea of literature. I wanted to continue on by talking a little bit about your brain on fiction, which is an article that I have posted below in our notes that you can access from the New York Times that talks a little bit about what happens from a neurological perspective when we read literature. I also wanted to talk about writing about fiction and some of the differences between a piece of literature that has some depth and sophistication and that is worthy of academic study as compared to that which is probably written for just profit or entertainment and probably is not necessarily that worth our time for academic study. And that oftentimes is called formula fiction because it is fiction that follows a particular formula rather than fiction that has a certain element of creativity to it. But first, I wanted to draw your attention to the textbook. That at the back of the textbook, there is a glossary of literary terms. So I asked you to skim that. I certainly don't expect you to read that. That's on page 1716 to 1739. But I wanted you to be aware that that was there as a resource that you could use over the course of the semester. So for instance, certainly you can use your cell or certainly you could use another resource if you wanted to. But one of the things that we were talking about in terms of literature is that it oftentimes is symbolic or it's representational. And if you wanted to look up the term symbol, we actually have a definition for that. A person, this is on page 1737, object, image, word, or event that evokes a range of additional meanings beyond and usually more abstract than its literal significance. Symbols are educational devices for evoking complex ideas without having to resort to painstaking explanations that would make a story more like an essay than an experience. And then it goes on and it continues to talk about different kinds of situations where you would find symbols. So I just wanted you to know that that was a resource that was available to you. In terms of the essay, Your Brain on Fiction, and again, I've posted a link to that below in the notes. It talks a little bit about what brain scans have revealed based on individuals who were scanned who were reading different kinds of literature. And that in the classical language regions of our brain, those areas were stimulated, which is what you would expect because people are basically reading words. However, what was more interesting is that other parts of the brain are activated as well, which is why the feeling of reading can feel so alive. So for instance, words like lavender and cinnamon and soap elicit a response not just in the language regions, but also in those areas of the brain that are related to scent, because those words are associated with scent. And there are a number of studies that they cite from different cultures and time periods. 2006 in Spain, for instance, where participants were asked to read words with strong odor associations and then read neutral words, and MRIs basically scan their brains. And when those individuals looked at words for things like perfume or coffee, for instance, the area of their brain that was responsible for scent lit up. When they saw words like chair and key, that area remained dark. And metaphors, which are in some ways symbolic. They are a comparison of two dissimilar things without using like or as. A metaphor, if you use like or as, that's a simile, by the way. Metaphors, for instance, also responded in the same way, or also had the same response, I should say, that figures of speech like a rough day are so familiar that ultimately they should be treated as words. However, a team of researchers from Emory University had their subjects in labs read metaphors involving texture. And the sensory cortex, which is responsible for perceiving texture through touch, became active. So metaphors like the singer had a velvet voice or he had leathery hands would rouse that area of the brain, while phrases that matched meaning, like the singer had a pleasing voice or he had strong hands, did not activate that area of the brain associated with touch. Same thing in terms of motion, and this was a study that was done in France. And participants read simple sentences such as John grasped the ball, or grasped the object, or Pablo kicked the ball. And that area in the motor cortex, that's the area of the brain that coordinates the body's movements, that not only were those areas activated, but the activity was concentrated in the part of the motor cortex that was responsible for that particular body part's movement. So when the movement described was arm related, well, then that area of the brain associated with the arm would be activated. When the movement was related to a leg, well, then that area associated with the leg would be activated. So what does this mean? The brain, it seems, does not make much of a distinction between reading about an experience and encountering it in real life. So basically, our brains work, at least according to one theorist, much like computer simulations on computers. That fiction, literature, with all of its details and metaphors and descriptions and symbols, offers an especially rich replica. And that novels and literature in general go beyond simulating reality because they give the reader an experience that's unavailable off of the page, the opportunity to enter fully into somebody else's thoughts and feelings. And if you've ever had the experience where you're reading and you forget that you're reading, then you know how incredibly powerful that experience can be. And that there is substantial overlap, at least according to a study that was done in Canada, in the brain networks used to understand stories and those areas that are used to understand interactions with other individuals, especially when we're trying to figure out the thoughts and feelings of other people. And this is called theory of mind. Narratives, literature, offer a unique opportunity to engage this capacity as we identify with characters' longings and frustrations, guess at their hidden motives, and track their encounters with friends and enemies, neighbors and lovers. So reading basically improves our real-life social skills. And certainly literature is important for a number of reasons. The idea of being a well-rounded individual, the idea of being able to improve one's writing through reading great pieces of literature, but also the idea that through reading we can experience and appreciate the perspectives of others in a way that we could never do. So this is as close as we're going to get to experience somebody else's reality. Again, we don't necessarily have to agree with their reality, but at least we can, on some level, experience that particular reality. And that said, I think it proves why it's important to spend time reading literature, just so that we can understand not only ourselves, but others. And when we start to talk about literature from an academic perspective, we'll need to talk about writing about it as well. And that's on page 46 to 65 in the textbook. If you remember, I was indicating that I wasn't able to find these particular textbook readings online because of copyright issues. But when we actually get to the literature itself, when we actually start reading short stories, which is how we'll begin, then I will be able to have online links that I can provide for you. But the text is available in the GCC library on reserve, and I'm covering the major pieces of the text that aren't available online. So on page 47, actually, we are given a list of questions. So these are questions that you can ask yourself when you are reading the literature. These are also questions you can ask yourself when you are writing about the literature. And you can see they've divided it up into sections such as character and plot and point of view. And certainly you can't go through and answer each individual question. But this will give you an idea of what it is you should be paying attention to when you are reading and ultimately writing. So plot. Does the plot conform to some sort of a formula? Is it predictable? What is the nature of the conflict? Because every piece of literature has some sort of conflict, or else there wouldn't be interest. The protagonist. Pro means positive. So this is supposed to be our hero or our main character. Is a story told chronologically? And if it's not, there's probably a reason why. What does the exposition or background information reveal? Is the conflict resolved at the end? And it may not be. And is the plot unified? Do all of the pieces relate to one another? And character, thinking about the fact, do you identify with the protagonist? This is question 7. And who or what is the antagonist? So the antagonist, anti, against. So this would be, in some ways, the villain, or in one way or another, the individual that serves as the contrast, or the thing that serves as the contrast to the protagonist. An antagonist could be something like weather. You think about trying to survive in a storm, for instance. Our protagonist might be basically fighting against the antagonist, which happens to be a winter storm. The author Jack London oftentimes does that in his stories. Do your responses change to the characters? Are the characters pretty flat? In other words, they just maintain one or two elements to them. Are they stock characters? Are they kind of stereotypical characters like the nosy neighbor? Or are they considered to be more round? In other words, they have multiple qualities associated with them. And how does the author reveal information about the characters? What minor characters exist, and how and why are they important? Setting. Where does a story take place and when? If an author's taken the time to give us those details are important. Is the setting used symbolically? Is it used as a representation of something else? And is the setting perhaps used as an antagonist? Again, I had talked about the idea of a snowstorm. Point of view. Who's telling the story, just like in real life? Not just the information you get, but who is giving you that information influences you in terms of the decisions you make about how valid the information is or how trustworthy you think the information is. How would it be different if the story was told by somebody else? Is the narrator reliable and objective? And does the author ever directly comment on the action? Symbolism. Did you notice any particular symbols in the story? How do they contribute to your understanding? Theme, a major truth or truths. Usually I say themes. What is the theme or the themes of this particular story? Is it stated directly? And I can tell you it probably won't be. It probably is suggested or implied. In many ways, you're like a detective using the clues to uncover the truth that the author has embedded within a particular text. Does the thesis confirm your values or challenge them? You don't have to agree with an author. Style, tone, and irony. Diction, language. In other words, how is this story told? What language is used? You can say that this person is attractive, or you can say, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. And both are very similar in terms of content, but very different in terms of diction and style. Is the diction formal or is it informal? And do you think the story is worth reading more than once? This is my basically layperson definition of a piece of literature that's worthy of study, that it has enough depth and complexity to it that each time you reread it, you can bring forth new meaning and new interpretation. And critical strategies, which we talked about last class. Is there a particular way or a particular lens to view this literature? For instance, biographical. Knowing information about the author, does that help you understand the story? Or historical. How does knowing about the time period that the story is set in, or the time period in which the story was written, and those can both be the same or different, help you understand? What kinds of evidence or pieces in the story are you focusing on? You're almost like an attorney. A good attorney can argue either side of the case, the defense or the prosecution. It's the same facts. They just have to decide which facts they are going to highlight. To what extent do your own experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions inform your interpretation? And given that there are a variety of ways to interpret the story, which one seems to be most useful to you? Again, as I had suggested, rather than selecting a literary school of interpretation and just saying that you're a psychological critic, I think it makes a lot more sense that you read the text first. You let the text dictate to you what makes sense in terms of a particular reading, because sometimes a particular reading makes more or less sense based on the construction of the story itself. And in fact, on page 50, what you can see is a sample piece of writing in progress. This happens to be somebody who is going through and brainstorming ideas. In fact, they wrote a first response that would be somewhat similar to what we would do for a journal. I had indicated that our journal assignments are going to ask you at the ending of each unit, the first being short story, second being drama, the third being poetry, that you select 3 of the pieces that we read and that you give about a page or so of response to each of the 3. So that is approximately a 3-page journal for short story, 3-page journal for drama, 3-page journal for poetry. And that it's very informal. I don't grade for grammar or mechanics, just for content. Think of it as a conversation on paper. And I evaluate it informally on a check mark system. So a plus is excellent, and a check plus is very good, and a check is satisfactory. That's where most of the grades fall, though there is a less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. The idea is that we're having a kind of conversation on paper, and your first journal won't be due until we get to the ending of the short story unit, so you've got a little bit of time because we haven't even read the short stories. But any thoughts or ideas or reactions, more than just plot? And some students like to write their journals as they are reading and ideas and questions occur to them. Some students like to wait until they're done reading so that they can synthesize what they've experienced. Some students like to wait until after class discussion so that you can utilize some of what I've talked about in my videos or some of what you might have discussed in the discussion forum. All of that is fine. But you can see how this particular person went through and then decided to brainstorm a list of major points that seemed to be important from their journal that eventually they turned into a formal academic paper on page 53. And eventually we will have a formal academic paper in class, and we'll talk about the idea of writing in drafts or stages, so that ultimately what you want to be able to do is not write something at the last minute, but continue to build on it over time. You'll end up with a much stronger piece of writing that way. But the journals can help you formulate ideas for something that you would be doing more formally for an academic paper, which again, we'll talk about as the semester progresses, because we don't have our first paper due for a little while. But I just wanted you to be aware that that was in the early section of readings. So, I was talking about literature and which literature is formulaic and which is more creative. And formula fiction, starting on page 30, talks about the idea of literature that probably is written primarily for profit or primarily for entertainment, rather than for making some sort of social or political statement. That said, you can engage in a piece of writing, or you can elect to pursue a piece of writing for making a social statement, but also you can entertain the idea of profit and entertainment, but that probably is not your major motivator. So if you talk to some of the great artists of the world, they'll probably tell you that yes, they produce their art for profit, but that ultimately their art is something that they would produce whether or not they received compensation for it, that they just feel the need to create. And formula fiction, again, this is on pages 30 to 43, it talks about how it follows, in effect, a formula. So there isn't a whole lot of creativity. There's a good level of predictability here. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think of it as comfort food. So you know that if you are reading, let's say, a romance novel, that everything will turn out well in the end, and they will live happily ever after. If you are reading a horror novel, then you expect some sort of monstrosity that's going to be presenting some sort of conflict for the individuals. So we don't usually consider these worthy of study because they usually are so predictable that they're formulaic and predictable and trite. That said, it is possible to write within a genre and also be creative. And in fact, we'll talk about this with Shakespeare, because he wrote in genres, comedies, histories, tragedies, and yet he still maintained creativity even though he followed a formula. So when we talk about genre literature, we're talking about things like westerns, for instance, or science fiction, for instance. But I was going to focus on the example that the text gives us, which happens to be romance novels, but we could have done this for any genre. So this is in no way to disparage romance novels, but all of these genres have very strict rules for plot, characters, setting, love scenes. And on page 26, it reviews what some of those rules would be, in this instance, for a romance novel. That the plot has to be about the growing relationship between the heroine and the hero. There has to be some misperception or conflict that keeps them apart, but that ultimately they end up together with a happily ever after. And almost always what we're going to get is a heterosexual relationship, with the heroine representing a modern American woman between the ages of 19 and 28. In other words, the ideal for what we consider beauty and energy for female. The story is told in the third person from her point of view, because the assumption is that the majority of readers reading romance novels are female. Not that that necessarily has to be the case. There can be another woman who has glitter and sophistication, but ultimately is unfavorable compared to the heroine. And that the heroine is spirited and independent without being pushy or stubborn, and that's a difficult balance to manage. Common careers include things like assistant nurse or teacher or interior designer, and while she can also be a doctor or a lawyer or other professional, work shouldn't dominate her, because ultimately the focus of her life is not her profession, but on forming a relationship. And the hero can be about 10 years older or so, and foreign or American. I always think to myself when I read that, how generous. He needn't be handsome in a traditional sense, but must be strongly masculine, well-built, affluent, good taste. His past might be somewhat mysterious or shrouded by a painful moment, a death perhaps of his spouse or divorce, but it's not its fault. And there are no chronic problems like alcoholism or addiction or sexual dysfunction, because there's a certain level of escapism associated with reading formula fiction that the reader should be able to engage in. And that this person is attractive not just as a lover, but a husband and father. Secondary characters are just that, secondary. Whether we have the other woman who serves as the foil to the heroine, the other man who's usually the decent sort, who's very helpful, or perhaps he's selfish, who's scheming, but in the end he won't be successful. And then other characters almost like furniture, like a nosy neighbor. Exotic settings usually best, romantic. New York City, London, Paris, Rio, the mountains, the ocean, though of course the ending can take place in a small town or suburbs. Again, the idea of establishing the 2.3 kid family. I always wondered about that 0.3 child myself, how that works. But love scenes, yes, they can have sex before marriage, but they can't be promiscuous, and certainly the descriptions can't be too graphic, because that is another genre called porn that has its own rules. And then the section on writing, which makes my heart sad. Avoid, and this is again to the author who is constructing a romance novel, avoid complex sentences, long paragraphs, lengthy descriptions. Use concise, vivid details to describe the heroine's world. It's one of the reasons why watching television or a movie is so much easier than reading, because you have to basically supply all the details when you're reading, details that are supplied to you on the screen if you are watching it on television or on film. Allow the reader to experience the romantic mood. Dialogue should sound like ordinary conversation. Writing should be contemporary English without slang, difficult foreign expressions, strange dialects, racial epithets, or obscenities. But hell or damn and a few other mouth swears are fine. And they're even told what to do in terms of length. 55,000 to 65,000 words in 10 to 12 chapters, which always makes me sad again. And I always think about when students ask me how long their writing should be, and I answer as long as it needs to be. And I don't mean to be sarcastic or facetious. I would never dare tell a painter how many colors to use on their canvas, much like I would never dare to tell a writer how many words they should use. That said, I do understand when students ask that question, they're getting or trying to get a sense of a ballpark of how much effort to put into the assignment, that a 4-page paper is different than a 40-page paper. But that said, I've always argue that a piece of writing is, the length is determined by the author, based on the subject matter and based on the need of the author to express that subject matter. Though when we talk about writing, we will talk about the idea of trying to be concise in your writing so that length doesn't come from unnecessary language. It comes from argument. So probably the best way to explain or show a piece of formula fiction is in the example they give you from actually a chapter of a romance novel entitled A Secret Sorrow. And we get on page 31 the synopsis of an entire novel so that we can jump into chapter 11. And that is not a good sign. Basically, what we get is a lot of melodrama and things that are very cliche, and I can very easily summarize it for you, where we have a couple, Faye and Kai, and Faye thinks that she needs to leave Kai because she is infertile, and she tries to keep it a secret from him, but he finds out, and basically the chapter that we're reading is the conversation they both have about the situation, where Faye says, I need to leave, it's not fair to you. Kai says no, she says yes, he says no, she says yes, he says we'll adopt, she says really, he says yes, they adopt and live happily ever after. And this is in no way to make light of their situation, because this can be a very serious situation for couples. But it's resolved in just a few paragraphs. In other words, it's not realistic. And while this is fine for a piece of entertainment, for escapism, or for generating profit, there probably isn't a whole lot there to analyze. That said, there have been feminist critics, because we talked last class about gender critics and feminist critics, who have studied things like soap operas and Harlequin romances to talk about how gender, and specifically female, happens to be portrayed in our society. And that's an interesting thing to do. That's when you can examine something from media and popular culture, which is an interest of mine. I teach classes in media and popular culture, things that weren't necessarily meant to be analyzed from an academic perspective, but yet you could, to see what kind of messages they give about our culture and society. So for instance, I teach a class in horror film, where obviously horror film was not meant to be studied from an academic perspective, but yet I select films that could be studied from an academic perspective so that we can see what those films tell us about our society and our culture. But the story that I really wanted to focus on was entitled The Sorrowful Woman. And you can see in the notes below that you've got a link for that. And I think that right from the beginning, we see a level of depth and complexity that we didn't see in the formulaic writing. And I wanted to talk about reading from the very beginning, so that if you're going to read a piece of literature, you should really begin with the author, Gail Godwin. Think about that. The author's name is Gail Godwin. What might that mean? And we are given a birth date, but not a death date. So that means the author is still alive, born in 1937. We're given a picture of the author, so it seems that what we've got is a female author. Born in Alabama, Gail Godwin was educated at the University of North Carolina and the University of Iowa, getting a PhD in English in 1971. No small feat, especially in 1971 for a female. And again, think about the time period in which she was born and how different life would be for female in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and even the 70s when this piece was published. She's won quite a few grants. In other words, she's very respected and esteemed. And her piece, A Sorrowful Woman, in 1971, already begins with probably a confusing statement, unlike what we saw with the previous piece. Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times, which leads us to immediately question, what does that mean? And we're not going to know what that means until we actually read the story in its entirety. And we'll probably, as I had suggested, need to reread. And that's usually my definition for a piece of literature. Does it require or benefit from rereading so that you can find new interpretation, new understanding? And I usually suggest 3 readings. The first for plot, the second for understanding and interpreting, and then the third to refresh your memory before you're going to write about the piece or talk about it. Though I do understand that that can be very challenging sometimes, and that sometimes you may only be able to give a piece one reading. But the more readings you can give a piece, the more likely it is that you can find the details in that particular piece. And even if we hadn't read the piece, we can begin to anticipate what that opening sentence might mean. Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times. And in fact, in terms of that, once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times, I thought that that might actually work as a discussion forum question about what do you think is the meaning of that particular term. Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times. Again, you know, this is a very small class. I have 3 enrolled, and at this point, only 1 has been participating. However, the good news is that we had a late add today, which means that we will have a roster of 4. So my hope is that we will have at least 2 people participating. But that means that the discussion forums are going to be particularly relevant if there are only 2 people who are discussing. And as I had indicated, I don't expect or anticipate that you respond to your peers, but you certainly can if you wanted to. You can think about it in the way that you would think about class discussion in a class, and that you can ultimately supply comments or questions if you think they're relevant. But you don't necessarily have to, but I do ask that you give your commentary and I will respond to it. And some of the things that you can think about when you're reading a short story, and you can see this in the notes that I have listed below. In addition to the author and the date and the title, notice that it's a sorrowful woman, not the sorrowful woman. So little details like that can be very important. The plot, as I talked about earlier, the characters, who are they? How do they interact with one another? What are their names? How might that be significant? The setting, how might that be significant? The use of language. And again, this is something that you can use with all pieces of literature. The theme or the ending. Or the theme or the major issue, and then the ending of the piece. Important quotes in the piece and why they're important. There are also questions that are usually included at the ending of the stories that are included in our textbook. Those can give you a clue about how to go about reading that piece. And oftentimes I'll be using some of those questions in order to direct our reading. And whatever questions you have about that particular piece. So again, what I'm going to do, I think, is just stop here and ask you to respond to the attendance question. Why do you think A Sorrowful Woman begins with the opening statement, and that's known as an epigraph, by the way, which we are told in the questions afterwards, that reads, once upon a time there was a wife and mother, one too many times. And I thought that what we could do then, because I'm hopeful by that point that we will have finished all of the dropping and the adding so that we can all be at the same place. Then we can talk about A Sorrowful Woman and talk about how it's very different from formula fiction, as well as interpret that piece and then continue on with some of the readings in our syllabus. So I hope you're doing well. I am doing well, and we will continue on next class analyzing A Sorrowful Woman. Take care. Bye-bye.